On this day, one remembers in Ireland the only person to be beatified in Ireland itself. It happened not that long ago in Dublin, in the big Jesuit church in Gardiner Street. And the blessed in question reposes there, John Sullivan. He had been brought up an Anglican, but at the age of 35 came over to the fullness of the faith. And he one day overheard a child saying, "God, make Mr. Sullivan a holy Jesuit." And he took that as a voice from God through the little child, and he became indeed a holy Jesuit. He lived essentially an academic life, but was a model of interiority and generosity in time and attention. He was ordained in the same chapel and in the same ceremony as another great Irish Jesuit, Willie Doyle. He himself probably will be beatified and, one hopes, canonized, for he was truly a heroic Jesuit, a martyr of charity in the trenches. These two touched me insofar as when I was studying in the Jesuit place in Dublin, Milltown Park, I would spend quite long moments in prayer and adoration in the chapel in question, in the heart of the big college. And one of our community actually was ordained there, way back. These things indicate how there is a communion between souls. They have passed to the same places. A similar thing happened in Rome. For all the big public exams happen in the same aula. It's constructed for that. And the white and black pebbles are there in the urns for voting. Both the license, Lectio Coram, and the doctorate happen always in that aula. And so it is that I was defending both the thesis of the license and later on, after ordination, the doctorate in the very same place, the very same seat as John Paul II would have, and many, many others over the years. Time stands still in those places. And also truth, for in that library, both in Milltown and in the Angelicum, one was in contact with the power of the Word. And it was both moments, 3 moments really, Dublin and twice over in Rome, there were truly moments of contemplation. Life was still a little simple in those days because it was not contaminated by modern gadgets. And the Word had a huge power. Moreover, student life was still not damaged by these modern things which have made of students little universes apart. Up until coming away from Rome altogether in 1999, we were still, when it came to the breaks between lectures, either going into the chapel, as it happens the Angelicum has adoration all day, or having an espresso, a coffee with other students, and there one would engage. now students don't do that in the same way. They go and they all engage with their smartphone. And so a part of the adventure of being a student has been lost, to the detriment of education and of human development. For that is part and parcel of being a student, rubbing shoulders with other students and sharpening one's mind in good, demanding conversation, knowing how to dialogue about anything, and also how to exchange truth with researched truth. Each one has his baggage. Also in Bangor, that happened because doing theology there was a lot of exchange going on there, especially as it was a mixed faculty. And one had students who had a lot to tell one, even in student days. There was a student there who became a Catholic university, and she was doing her research on Newman, a very interesting student to listen to. Hours and hours in the library, because all the works of Newman were in the library. And also, I've brushed with previously the same thing, that element of being able to learn so much from other people. What's happening now? Unfortunately, the virtual has become more real than the immediate reality in front of our eyes, not only among students, but in families. One has a job, it seems, to get children off these things. And if it comes to the table as well, it's devastating. This thing is more important than Daddy and Mammy and the siblings. We have lost them already in adolescence and pre-adolescence if we're not careful. But only here once, and not to see what's going on is a tragedy for us and also for any that we might have an influence over if we don't warn them before they waste their life in the virtual. It extends also to the likes of future marriage contacts. Many meet now virtually. It's not safe. One can sell a false article on the internet and only discover there's hidden baggage later on. It's very different from meeting other people and getting to know them really in calm, patient conversations. One knows a person well only after a good long time and after the mask has been scraped off, because one lives forever with the person who is there and not the person advertised. This day in Italy is a big Marian Day. We're in the month of Mary, and the 8th of May is the Supplica of Pompeii, the construction of the massive basilica of the Holy Rosary in a very poor area is nothing short of miraculous. Our Lady intervened directly. This man was working for the wrong side. He was in some kind of satanic cult, or at least Masonic cult, and he was getting more and more depressed. Suddenly, heaven got hold of him, and heaven had a project for him. And he was the one, blessed Bartolomeo, or rather Bartolo Longo, who out of nowhere found funds coming to construct this huge, huge, beautiful basilica in a very, very poor area near Naples. And there the rosary goes on without a break. And the day, it's very moving. It's well prayed, and it's a reminder of its power. And through there, through his experiences, through what was given by heaven, the diffusion of the 54-day novena started to spread. and caught on. It's very popular in Ireland. People actually see its effect. It can be researched quite easily on internet, and it is not difficult to do. Many, many, many are the testimonies of answered prayer with the 54-day novena. And it also rejoins what happens later this week, the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, on Saturday the 13th of May. She called herself the Lady of the Rosary, and it was the one thing she asked for each time at each apparition, the recitation of 5 decades of the Rosary. And that has come through again, in fact, not in Fatima only, but in our own time, ongoing at Medjugorje, the insistence on the Rosary. And also at Garabandal, the teaching of the children on how to pray it, because we have on tape the way in which they were praying it with heaven. And they were going at the rhythm Our Lady was indicating. It was very posé, very slow, which could be a lesson for us who oftentimes are in high-speed automatic pilot. With regard to academia, it could be asked why Our Lady insisted on the Holy Rosary. People might say, well, that's very simple. I find it too simple, too repetitive. It would seem that the reason why she insisted on that so much was that it's the one thing that all, from Pope to little child, can do. And Pope John Paul II gave a whole teaching and document on it, making it more vibrant, introducing scriptural meditations. And when the Rosary is celebrated, not just said, chant, music, intentions come in, and it can be vivified. I saw it happening in France in the Charismatic Renewal, been taken on board by the Lion de Juda, the present Beatitude, and it was really celebrated. And in there, it was electrified. Things would happen. Gifts of the Spirit would break through. Therefore, we need to be aware that what heaven blesses is truly blessed, better than anything we can imagine. Indeed, the Beatitude, they wear the rosary on their habit, on their belt. And quite a few Dominicans do that as well, still, even young ones. We know how the rosary was their great weapon, requested by Our Lady, given from heaven to counteract the Albigensian heresy. They were born in that optic, the order of preachers. Well, with regard to academia, we have interesting examples of people who have had a specific vocation to work therein. One in fairly recent times, although he's now long dead, but not in his writings, they live powerfully on, is C.S. Lewis. He called himself the most dismayed convert in Christendom. He yielded to what was before his eyes, the Christian truth. And he wielded his pen with great power. Millions and millions of books resulting from his pen, because they were translated quickly into other languages. We had the Screwtape Letters read in Italian in the monastery. And he was somebody who influenced me in adolescence, because my brother sent me things of his from Oxford, Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters. And then in the monastery in France, my mother brought me Fern Seeds and Elephants. And these were powerful works which indicate the logical mind of this great man, who also was able to enter into the mind of a child and was very good to them. He would reply to them. A massive correspondence. Narnia. And the way in which he influenced souls is interesting. He was an Anglican, a very Anglican. In fact, there's the church not too far from here where he would worship with his brother. And we forget that he had a lot to do with Ireland. He was born and educated in the north, but he had a lot to do with this area. His brother was very unwell, and he was saved essentially by the holy foundress of the Medical Missionaries of Mary nearby here, who was founding the hospital, the order and the hospital of the Our Lady of Lourdes. It was the Medical Missionaries of Mary who had that training hospital being built. And when it came to the first encounter with Catholicism in that form, the reactions of these two brothers, C.S. Lewis and his brother Warren, are very interesting. We have mention of 3 well-appointed churches that belong to religious orders: Dominicans, Franciscans, and Augustinians. These were supplemented within further short walks in all directions by convents, which were homes to the Daughters of Charity, the Presentation Sisters, and the Sisters of Mercy, as well as an enclosed order of Dominican nuns. On his daily walk to visit Warren, his brother, C.S. Lewis, he's actually called Jack in the family, would also pass other groups of buildings belonging to the Christian Brothers, whose schools then dominated the education of boys in the town. Figures dressed in religious garb were a common sight on the streets of the town every day. And if these hives of activity were not sufficient testament to the central place of religion in the life of the town and its people, the ruins of earlier monasteries and churches were also still to be found in the vicinity. It's hardly surprising that even C.S. Lewis, coming from the famed city of spires, as Oxford was known, felt somewhat overwhelmed or even suffocated by the preponderance of religious architecture. C.S. Lewis was in fairly intense correspondence in Latin with a very holy Italian priest, a founder of several congregations in Italy, Don Giovanni Calabria, in Verona. At one point he expressed this to him: "I am crossing over, if God is so pleased, to Ireland, my birthplace and dearest refuge. So far as charm of landscape goes, and temperate climate, although most dreadful because of the strife, hatred, and often civil war between dissenting faiths." When it came to encountering the Catholic faith and practice, both brothers were pleasantly surprised. Getting to know people heart to heart and seeing how faith influences the heart and brings out the best of it. Warren, the one who's ill, has this to say, because he's in the care of these holy nuns who save his life, and they nurse him for years, off and on. He's backwards and forwards to that hospital. "So far as I had any idea of a convent, it was something grey and secret, with sad-faced women gliding about noiselessly, rarely speaking and never smiling. There could be nothing more preposterously unlike the truth. The first thing that strikes you is the radiant happiness of these holy and lovable women. Whatever else it is a life of joy and a place of laughter." Indeed, we know from other testimonies that Mother Mary was keen on cultivating joy and specifically the sense of the Irish wit. It was a great lubricant in community. Now, she knew that C.S. Lewis was a great author, and she asked him to do her a favour, Mother Mary Martin. Aware of his literary fame and never one to pass up an opportunity, she asked Jack to write something for the Medical Missionary of Mary's magazine for the Order's 10th anniversary edition. He readily agreed and set to work in his room in the White Horse Hotel, one of those rare occasions when he wrote away from his Oxford desk. Years later, Walter Hooper, in his mission to find and publish everything he could discover of his friend and mentor's works, came to know Mother Mary and her nuns. He recovered the essay Jack had written for Mother Mary and republished it under the title Some Thoughts. The archive edition of the original article, however, includes a humorous and affectionate introduction which Hooper decided to omit in his republication. A brief excerpt from the article with its original introduction is included below for the first time, and here it is. Some thoughts of the Anglican visitor. You must not imagine that I, Anglican layman as I am, appear in the pages of this magazine as a gate crasher or even as a volunteer. The editress, rashly courteous, asked me to contribute something, and since the command of a lady, especially a lady of that house, in which I have experienced overflowing kindness, is not to be resisted, here I am. I have been wondering a good deal what I can possibly say, and am a little nonplussed, as Pip was in Great Expectations, when a much less kindly lady suddenly said to him, "Play, little boy!" On the whole, I think it will be best to try and share with you some thoughts which have spontaneously arisen in my mind during my short but refreshing acquaintance with the Lourdes Hospital. So here's the article. It's not too long, but it's interesting. At first sight, nothing seems more obvious than that religious persons should care for the sick. No Christian building, except perhaps a church, is more self-explanatory than a Christian hospital. Yet, on further consideration, the thing is really connected with the undying paradox, the blessedly two-edged character of Christianity. And if any of us were now encountering Christianity for the first time, he would be vividly aware of this paradox. No other belief leaves anyone free to do what is being done in the Lourdes Hospital every day, to fight against death as earnestly, skillfully, and calmly as if you were a secular humanitarian, while knowing all the time that death is, both for better and worse, something that the secular humanitarianism has never dreamed of. The world, knowing how all our real investments are beyond the grave, might expect us to be less concerned than other people who go in for what is called higher thought, and tell us that death doesn't matter. But we are not high-minded, and we follow one who stood and wept at the grave of Lazarus. Not surely because he was grieved that Mary and Martha wept and sorrowed for their lack of faith, though some thus interpret, but because death, The punishment of sin is even more horrible in his eyes than in ours. The nature which he had created as God, the nature which he had assumed as man, lay there before him in its ignominy, a foul smell, food for worms. Though he was to revive it a moment later, he wept at the shame. If I may here quote a writer of my own communion, I am not so much afraid of death as ashamed of it. And that brings us again to the paradox. Of all men, we hope most of death. Yet nothing will reconcile us to, well, its unnaturalness. We know that we were not made for it. We know how it crept into our destiny as an intruder, and we know who has defeated it. But because we know that the natural level also is God's creation, we cannot cease to fight against the death which mars it, as against all those other blemishes upon it, against pain and poverty, barbarism and ignorance. Because we love something else more than this world, we love even this world better than those who know no other. It is Walter Hooper who has done most work with regard to collecting, saving, publishing, organizing the work of C.S. Lewis. And he had a surprise one day. To his astonishment, Pope John Paul II, himself a philosopher and poet, had requested a visit from him to talk with him about Lewis. In several recorded interviews afterwards, Walter Hooper described the encounter. In November of 1994, I was asked to go to Rome to talk with John Paul II about Lewis. I met him after his general audience, and he explained that he had greatly valued Lewis's 1960 study, The Four Loves. He also asked me a very pastoral question. Do you still love your old friend? I replied that I did, both with storge, that's the love of familial affection, and philia, that's friendship. I did my best to answer his questions, thinking all the time how alike these two men were. At the end, the Pope said something I found deeply moving. C.S. Lewis knew what his apostolate was, and he did it. One could say the same about John Paul II, who appeared to know more about Lewis's works than I realized. I believe he was personally behind their translation into Polish. If one looks into his life, one discovers that there is a very kind heart and generous disposition in C.S. Lewis. He was extremely generous. He wouldn't make a noise. He was very good to the lady who took him in after the First World War. What had happened was that he and his friend had promised to each other that what should one die, that the other would look after the parent. And therefore he was faithful to that. He was injured himself, his friend was lost in the war, and he looked after this lady and lived in her house, the Kilns. But he would be doing chores and things. We forget that side of him. But he was very good also for answering letters, and shows how he could enter into the mind of a child, and also he took care of those who were looking to him spiritually. He had a huge influence. And that influence carries on. He knew pain. He married late in life. It was a lady actually who was in contact with him because of his writing. And it was fairly brief because she had cancer which went into remission rather unexpectedly, actually, in a miraculous way, and then it came back later. But they did have a few years of married life, and he was good to his two stepsons, paying for their education well. And he knew, therefore, what pain was. Pain, in this case, not only of physical illness, because his health was very weak. He died 10 years before his brother, actually, even though his brother was very unhealthy for long. He was so generous with other people, C.S. Lewis. Well, this element of pain comes through in the interior pain that he suffered after the loss of his wife, Joy. And he has written about pain, the problem of pain. It's again indicating his logical mind. Everything he writes is logical. And he himself, before dying, thought how he could take care of Walter's needs. Walter Hooper was taking care of his works. And he thought that it wouldn't be perhaps enough to look after things. Hooper calmly replied not to worry, that his works would sell very well. And his prophecy, of course, came true. Millions and millions of copies sold in different languages. One thinks here of two men who lived about the same period, very different. The other that comes to mind is the other convert of the same period, Thomas Merton. He himself was a case of the triumph of grace over someone who could have gone completely astray. Indeed, he went astray for a good while. But then, calmly, he was brought along, and a key moment in his life was when he opened the scriptures asking for a word to know which way to go. And his finger fell on the verse, "And you will be silent." He took it literally and entered the trap of Gethsemane. Fortunately, his abbot, James Fox, was wise and saw he had a talent and used it. So these two are long deceased, but the power of the pen is such that even from academia, life can still come. And that was my experience in university days, especially in Rome. In these volumes, on these old shelves, there is power, huge power. Indeed, such was the power coming from the writings of Adam Scott that I was doing the research on, that I wanted to do what he did. He was a Premonstratensian abbot in Scotland, and he fled, as it were, to become a Carthusian and carried on writing. But the power of his writing is such that one sees that one generation can still teach the next from beyond the grave and call and even change a life. Such is the voice of Quiet Ink. Here's Milltown, where happy months were spent in the corridors of learning. Here's the last picture of my father before he died. Time passes, and we pass.